Okay, it seems that we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Lancaster Psychology Research Showcase series. My name is Agata, and I'm going to host today's talk. So today we have Professor Mark Levine, who will talk about bystanders for good. Could you move on to the next slide, Mark? I'm not sure if that worked.
Does that not work?
Not on my end. Okay, now I think there's a bit of a delay. That's fine. Right. So yes. So again, thank you everyone for joining. I'm hoping that this will run smoothly, but I think there's a slight delay on our end. So if there are any technical glitches, then please just bear with us. We have a cat among our audience. Right, so this talk will run for 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. We're hoping to get quite a few questions in and have a bit of a discussion. So feel free to write your questions in the Q&A box at any point, and then we will publish them as they come in. And then you can also vote for the questions if you like them. If you think they're interesting, then they're more likely to be asked. And we'll ask as many as we can, but of course we might run out of time. So you can also turn on subtitles if you want to, but they are automatically generated, so unfortunately they might not be perfect. So apologies about that.
No, it's okay.
And I think with that, I can give the floor to Mark. So I will now switch the camera. Yes. Okay, Mark, if you want to get started.
Okay, slides are there. Thanks, Agata. Thanks for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. As Agata said, my name is Mark Levine. I'm a professor of social psychology at Lancaster University, and my research interests are in group psychology and its influence on behaviour for both pro-social and antisocial outcomes. And this evening, I'm going to talk to you about one strand of that work that I've been doing for quite a long time now on the behaviour of bystanders. And I'm going to try and persuade you that what you think you know about bystanders may not be the complete story. Because even for those of you who've never done any psychology, I suspect you'll have a view about what bystander behaviour might look like, and suspect somehow that in contemporary society we may have a problem that bystanders don't tend to intervene, that we live in a society in which people just walk on by. And that feeling is captured in this quote from Elie Wiesel, who's a Nobel laureate and a Holocaust survivor. And Wiesel wrote about his experience in the Holocaust: "What hurts the victim most is not the cruelty of the oppressor, but the silence of the bystander." In other words, bystanders are worse than perpetrators for standing by when people are in need. And we're kind of familiar with the idea that there can be no such thing as a neutral bystander. You can't just be on the sidelines when people need help. We sometimes hear of innocent bystanders, and they tend to be people who are shot in random drive-by shootings or are the victims of some kind of misfortune just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But by and large, the idea we have about bystanders is that they are guilty by definition. The very notion of a bystander seems to imply that people don't act. In psychology, and again, some of you may already know about this, even though you haven't studied any psychology, the signal crime, the most famous example of bystander inaction, is the Kitty Genovese case. And Kitty Genovese was murdered by a man called Winston Moseley in New York in 1964. And the New York Times wrote about that horrible murder that 38 witnesses had stood in their windows, illuminated against the glass, watching this murder unfold over a half-hour period, and nobody did anything. And it was that event that set off the entire canon of research in social psychology on bystander behavior and the bystander effect. And that story still appears today in social psychology textbooks as a marker of the kind of thing that we're studying when we study bystander behavior. Except it turns out that that story was one of the early examples of fake news. It just didn't happen, or it didn't happen in the way that the New York Times wrote it up some 2 weeks after the actual murder took place. And that story of the inactive 38 bystanders who stood by apathetically while this unfolded was actually the product of a conversation between the New York chief of police and the chief editor of the New York Times. And they put together this sort of story, partly, I think, to encourage people to intervene. But in fact, in the actual event itself, there were never 38 witnesses who saw Mosley and Genovese together. Maybe 2 or 3 people had ever seen them together at any one time. None of them saw the murder, which happened inside the stairwell of Genovese's building, not out in the open where people could see. And there was a lot of intervention. People shouted out and scared Mosley off. People phoned the police. So there's been lots of work now which shows that this model that we have in our head, this picture of inactivity of the 38 witnesses, which drives this whole idea, actually is not true. And so I've begun to wonder over the last 20 years of working in this area, whether the whole idea of the problem of bystanders as the way we understand it is also built on shaky foundations. And that's what I'm going to try and persuade you tonight. I'm going to challenge 3 key ideas. Firstly, that bystanders don't help, which everyone seems to think is the case. Secondly, and this is the idea of the bystander effect in psychology, that if there are lots of other people around, then the likelihood of people helping is reduced. This idea of the bystander effect, that there's diffusion of responsibility or something. And thirdly, I'm going to challenge the idea that in order for us to get successful bystander intervention, we need to free people from the negative influence of the group. I'm going to show you that those 3 claims are not supported by the evidence, that when you look at the evidence, actually bystander helping rates are very high, that the presence of other people around actually enhances the likelihood of helping, particularly in serious, dangerous, violent emergencies like the Genovese case, and that successful bystander intervention, rather than being inhibited by the group, actually relies on cooperation amongst bystanders, cooperation with others. So the group is important for successful intervention. And I'm going to try and leave you with the idea that we've been asking the wrong question for too long. We shouldn't be asking, why don't people help? We should actually be asking, what makes bystander intervention successful or unsuccessful? Because most of the time there will be some attempt to intervene. Okay, but before we get that far, I want to try and change the picture that you might have about what's really at stake when we think about bystanders. We've talked about the Genovese case and this idea that lots of people around are apathetic and don't help. And that picture is very influential because it sets the tone for what we think we're studying. And I want to replace that, if I can, with a different picture. A picture which I think more represents what happens when bystanders are exposed to violent emergencies. And this is a very contemporary example. In fact, at the moment, there the inquest is being held into the London Bridge terror attack of 29th of November 2019. And that event, for those of you who don't remember, started in Fishmongers Hall by the side of London Bridge. And it was an event organized by a charity called Learning Together, who specialized in prisoner rehabilitation. And at that event was a man called Usman Khan, who'd been in prison for most of his adult life for terrorist offenses. And halfway through the morning of that event, Khan emerged from a first floor toilet with big knives taped to both of his hands and started to attack people in the room. He very quickly stabbed Jack Merritt and Saskia Jones, 2 Learning Together workers. And there was blood and screaming and chaos. And what did the bystanders do? Did they all turn and save themselves and flee for their lives? Or did they become involved in some way? And what we know from that event, and here are some of the people who actually turned and confronted Khan, active bystanders. Amongst them was Lukas Kozochik, who was a kitchen porter, who actually ran up 2 flights of stairs, carrying a long pole and began to engage Khan in combat. Darren Frost, who was a Ministry of Justice employee, and he famously took the narwhal tusk off the wall to use as a weapon. No one knew what a narwhal tusk was, but now we all do. There was John Crilly, who was also a prisoner on day release, and he'd once been jailed for murder, and he was the one who grabbed the fire extinguisher and set off the spray. James Ford, another person convicted of murder, was towards the end of his sentence. He tried to save Saskia Jones. He tackled Khan. And when the action moved outside, when Khan left the hall and got onto the bridge, other people joined, people like Stevie Hurst and Thomas Gray. These were tour guides who joined in on the bridge, and they kicked away one of the knives. So there was a lot of intervention. And I want to show you some footage captured on the smartphone on London Bridge of exactly that event, to get into your head a different version of what it might look like for bystander behaviour. Let me see if I can do that. There's not much sound to start with. There is a little bit of sound at the end, and I'll narrate a bit over the top. So this is the bridge just outside Fishmongers Hall, and in a moment, oh, hello. Where did it go? Here we go. Let me try again. In a moment, you should see Khan emerge, followed by some of the bystanders. There you'll see he's running along the bridge. And here come Crilly. So you'll see there's the fire extinguisher. See the picture of them working together, trying to chase him and hold him down. The person filming crosses the road. Other bystanders come to join. They're the two latecomers joining. One of them kicks away the knife. So bystanders coming to intervene. The police haven't arrived yet, but they are about to arrive. Here's yet another bystander coming to join. Armed police arrive extremely quickly to this event. They're within a couple of minutes. They are activated and arrive. And it turns out that Usman Khan is wearing what looks like a suicide vest. And here's a policeman when he comes across, and you'll see suddenly people hear that there's a vest, a suicide vest. Policeman shouts out. And they think he might detonate the bomb, and then policemen shoot Khan. But this is the picture I want to leave you with, of these bystanders who are all strangers to each other. They don't know one another. They're working together and coordinating in some way at great risk to themselves. This is a man who might have a suicide bomb. Certainly he's got knives, but this is not the normal picture we think of when we think about how bystanders behave. But maybe this is an anomaly. Maybe this is just some lucky coincidence of the right people being together at the right time. In fact, when you start to look at these sorts of events, you can see that this kind of bystander intervention is incredibly common. About 3 years before, there was a similar attack on London Bridge. 3 men drove cars into pedestrians and then went into Borough Market and attacked people. And again, you can see footage on YouTube of bystanders helping other people, sometimes people who've been stabbed and they themselves are attacked, but also trying to tackle the 3 men by throwing things at them and helping the police. And there are examples from all over the world of bystanders intervening in these kind of roving terrorist attacks. In fact, I discovered a paper on that people had done studying suicide bombings in Israel over a 3-year period when there were a large number of these kinds of attacks. And those researchers discovered that in around 40% of occasions, and remember, Khan was wearing a suicide vest, so they had every expectation that he might be able to blow himself up. In these kinds of events, around 40% of the time, bystanders intervene. And this is probably the most likely threat to your life, because those kinds of interventions are normally the trigger for the bomber to explode their device. And what that research discovered was when people intervene, even though it's often fatal for them, the overall casualty rates, because they are often disturbed before the moment where they can cause maximum damage, is reduced by about 28%. So those people are saving the lives of other folk. Okay, so that's a different picture, I think, of the way in which we normally think about bystanders. And I think from watching that incident, you can begin to see that there is a story which says that actually bystanders do intervene, even if it's incredibly dangerous and risky. They intervene to help strangers. These people didn't know each other. They intervene even though the costs may be very high. And also, they don't need to have heroic personalities. Several of the people who intervened on London Bridge had been in prison for the most serious crimes. It would be hard to create a story about them having heroic personalities, and yet they still were able to behave extremely pro-socially in this particular instance. So you don't need to be a good person, whatever that is, to do these kinds of good things. These folks find a way to cooperate, and it's that cooperation with others that's the key to successful intervention. And that's what I'm going to try and talk you through for the rest of the talk today. Because that story is really at odds with what we think about in terms of the traditional bystander effect. Remember, I talked about the Kitty Genovese case. Two famous social psychologists, John Darley and Bibb Latané, took that case and used it as the start for hundreds and hundreds of studies which have been done on bystander behavior. And that work began to establish the idea that the presence of other people, or the group, is actually really bad for decision making. That the more bystanders who are around, the less likely an individual is to help. And they talk about negative forces like diffusion of responsibility or pluralistic ignorance or audience inhibition. And that long body of work has made us think that the problem to be solved in bystander behavior is this malign influence of group processes on the individual. That if we want to promote bystander behavior, we need to somehow free the individual from these negative influences of the group. And I think that that's a mistake, and I'll try to show you why. Okay. Maybe you might be thinking, okay, well, the Kitty Genovese story might be fake news, but it doesn't matter. I mean, I've just told you that there are hundreds and hundreds of studies which apparently show this bystander effect. Isn't it possible that the bystander effect could be true, even though the origin story, the Kitty Genovese story, is fake news? Well, there's actually a way to answer that question. In psychology, we can have a procedure for bringing together lots and lots of different studies called a meta-analysis. And it looks at the effect size in lots of different studies, the likelihood of a particular effect being true by combining the effect sizes of these different studies to see overall, over the hundreds and hundreds of studies, whether there is such a thing, for example, as the bystander effect. And there have been several of these over the years. In the early 80s, there was an argument that indeed there was this remarkably consistent phenomenon called the bystander effect. And that's why I think it still has a presence in psychology. And that's why sometimes outside psychology, people think the bystander effect is a robust phenomenon. But over the years, those meta-analyses, the studies of studies, have begun to show that actually the bystander effect is not always supported by the evidence. Particularly, the bystander effect does not seem to occur in serious, violent, or dangerous emergencies like the ones I've been showing you. It does happen on low cost, not very serious events, so dropping pens or helping people with their shopping if they've fallen over, that kind of stuff. But in serious emergency situations, not only does the bystander effect not seem to happen, in fact, there's now consensus of research which says it can be reversed. In other words, having more people around is more likely to produce bystander intervention. And the overall levels of intervention are still actually quite high. Okay, so because we've been interested in this, in what really happens in bystander behavior, we've started to do some systematic research in this area. And one of the problems with the research, body of research in psychology in this area is something which you could call an ecological validity gap. And what I mean by that is that most research on bystander behavior in psychology doesn't analyze real data from real life emergencies as they unfold in real time, for very good practical and ethical reasons. We can't just go around setting up real life emergencies where people are wandering around with knives just to see what people do. So most of the data that we have is self-report data from questionnaires or focus groups. Most of it is retrospective. So we ask people about what they did or didn't do after the fact. And we know from lots of research now that what people say and what they actually do is not always the same thing, particularly in bystander behavior. People often say, yes, I would intervene, or if I didn't, they give a story about why they didn't, which makes them a kind of more morally responsible person. But there is a gap between the word and the deed. And when we move into the laboratory, where we can actually test causal relationships, those tend to be very stripped down, decontextualized kind of things. We can't really do real life emergencies in labs. So there's a gap in the knowledge base about what really happens in real life emergencies like the ones I've shown you. And we've tried to fill that recently through the use of the rise of CCTV surveillance in our public spaces. The UK is one of the most surveyed public spaces in the world. And we've worked with various holders of that data, city councils and police in a number of different countries, to try and get hold of lots and lots of examples of these real life emergencies where bystanders are involved, to try and look at what really happens in real life. And I'm going to show you an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. Now, this is not one of the examples we have in our database. This is one I found on YouTube. I can't show you the ones that we use because of the agreement I have with the people who provide them for me, but this gives you an idea of the kind of material that we are using to analyze bystander behavior. And I'll talk you through it as we go along so you'll get a sense of what we do. So you'll see here is an argument in the nighttime economy. There's lots of folks around. There's a guy sitting on the ledge, and this guy in the vest definitely wants to have a go at him for some reason. Already you can see lots of bystanders getting involved, coming over to find out what's going on. The woman is separating them, is trying to calm things down, and we are coding who the protagonist is, who the target is, who the bystanders are. We're coding the gender of the bystanders. We're coding every aggressive or escalatory gesture by the target, by the victim, by the bystanders. We are also coding every de-escalatory and calming down gesture. And you can see there's lots and lots of stuff going on. And this guy's taking his shirt off, which is often a sign that something is about to happen. Lots of hands wide gestures. This has been going on for quite a long time. And then there's a punch, and there's a bit of fighting. And this is a nasty, nobody's doing anything for a bit, and then it sort of stops still a bit more, and then they separate. Lots of moving around. The protagonist, perpetrator, moves away. Still lots of pointing and gesturing. It looks as though it's going to be over, and then they start to come back again, and then again you immediately see they are met by other bystanders trying to stop things from kicking off. Someone separating stuff out. And I guess the story that you see how much bystander involvement there is in these sorts of events, and how much of a choreography it is between bystanders, perpetrators and victims, but the important role that bystanders seem to be playing. And so we started to use this sort of data to try and answer some very fundamental questions about bystander behavior. So the first thing we wanted to know is, how often do bystanders intervene in these kinds of things? And we were also interested in whether the kind of place that the event was taking place in, the country, for example, if it was more or less dangerous, does that make a difference too? Do people worry in more dangerous countries that they might get shot if someone has a gun, so they won't intervene? And to do this, we collected CCTV footage similar to the one I've just shown you from South Africa, from the Netherlands, and from the United Kingdom. And we talked to the CCTV operators so we could collect all of these together. And then the first question we asked was, how likely is bystander intervention? In what proportion of these cases does some bystander intervene? And then we were interested in, does it make a difference where it happens? So South Africa, which was one of the kind of murder capitals of the world, where it's much more dangerous in public spaces, are people less likely to than they are in the Netherlands, the United Kingdom? So I'd just like you to imagine in your head, estimate the percentage of instances that of the kind I've just shown you where at least one person intervenes. Do you think it'd be 10% or 20 or 30, maybe half, 50%, a bit more? Also think about which country has the lowest intervention rate of the three, South Africa, Netherlands, United Kingdom, and you may be surprised by the answers. Firstly, in 90%, nearly 91% of the situations, so 9 in 10, just more than 9 in 10, somebody intervenes in one of these kinds of incidences. So intervention is incredibly likely to happen. And it's not just one person. Our average is between 3 and 4. So it's a number of people who intervene, similar to the scene I've just shown you. Do those figures change as a consequence of where these events are taking place? So is it the levels lower in South Africa? Well, it turns out not at all. These things don't make a difference. Intervention levels across these different countries are all equally high. So this is just, do people do something? And you can see somebody does some kind of intervention, and remarkably frequently. And that doesn't really sit very neatly with what we think is happening in bystander intervention, particularly in these kinds of violent events where you think people probably wouldn't do it. Okay, so I think that for a long time we've been asking the wrong question. I think there's lots and lots of evidence in all the examples I've shown you, even in the Kitty Genovese example, that people did intervene. Maybe getting people to intervene isn't the problem. The thing we need to solve is, if people are intervening a lot, what makes interventions successful and why is it sometimes unsuccessful? And I think that's an important and different question, and is the key to harnessing the power of social psychology to promote practical and successful bystander intervention. And that's the thing we've been interested in. What makes successful versus unsuccessful intervention? So in another one of our studies with this CCTV stuff, we looked at a number of incidents of events on the street. But this time when we worked with the CCTV operators, half of the events we had ended peacefully. So they saw something, the operators, that they thought had the spark for violence, but it was extinguished before violence happened or before the police had to come. And the other half of our sample ended in violence, that there was a spark and then there was some aggression. And all of them have some kind of bystander intervention. And as before, we coded who was the protagonist, who was the perpetrator, who was the victim, who were the bystanders. And again, we coded escalation, push, punch, prod, de-escalation, kind of open palms, separating people, holding people back. And this time we compared the behavior patterns with the outcome, whether it ended well or badly. And we started looking at what happens after every time a protagonist, the perpetrator, does some kind of aggressive escalatory act. And that's what this rather scary thing looks like. And I'll talk you through it just so I can explain what it means. The little black dot that you can see on, well, it's on the left-hand side of my screen. I suspect it might be on the same as yours. That in our coding frame is every example in our sequence of acts where a perpetrator does something aggressive or escalatory. So a point, a punch, a prod, or a kick. And we looked at what the bystanders do when they see that. And in the way that we coded things, bystanders could only do one of two things. The bystanders could do something to de-escalate and calm down the situation, or they could do something to escalate it. They too could throw a punch or a kick or a prod or up the ante. So there's only two things that can be done, an escalatory act or a de-escalatory act. And we looked at what the bystanders do when they see a perpetrator doing something aggressive, and then we look at what happens as the first response to the perpetrator aggression, and then the second response, and then the third response, and then the fourth response. And what we're trying to do is to say, how many responses by bystanders do we need to have before we can tell whether this incident that we're watching is going to end violently or peacefully? And from this, this picture that I'm showing you, you can see that the first act, the first two boxes after the black dot, doesn't help us to determine whether things are going to end badly or well. Even if we know two acts, and that's moving on to the second set of four boxes, that still doesn't let us predict whether it's going to end badly or well. once we start to know 3 bystander acts, then we can start to predict with a degree of accuracy whether this event that we're watching is going to ending peacefully or violently. So it seems as though 3 separate acts are required. And we weren't quite sure what that meant. And so we started to try and do a bit more research. So we looked to see who does these acts amongst the bystanders. Is it always the same person going, stop, that's the first act, stop again, that's the second act, and stop, that's the third act? Or is it 2 of the bystanders? Remember, in all our events, there are lots of bystanders around. There's never only one. There's always at least 3 or 4 bystanders who could intervene. And what we discovered when we looked at this is, so what I'm showing you now is an analysis of who does the 3 acts. And you can see at the bottom where it says 111. That means it's the same person doing the same 3 acts. 112, 121, and 122 are all combinations of 2 bystanders. Somebody going stop, stop, and then another bystander joining in, or 1 bystander, then a second bystander, then the first bystander again. And it's only on the right-hand side that you see the 3 acts are done by 3 separate bystanders, 1, 2, and 3. And what this picture is showing you is that when it's 1 bystander on their own intervening 3 times, in the presence of other people who are not supporting them, then those events are much more likely to end in violence than peace. Any combinations of 1 and 2 bystanders in the middle, although it looks as though it might be significantly different, in fact it isn't. So that doesn't really tell us very much about the trajectory. What shows up very strongly, though, is that when it's 3 separate bystanders doing the 3 acts, that's much, much more likely that the situation will end in peace. And what's sort of happening there is bystander goes to the perpetrator and says, calm down, calm down. Bystander goes to the victim and says, are you all right? Don't respond. Third bystander comes in and says, yeah, let's keep this nice and calm. And that collective voice of the bystanders seems to be the thing that produces the peace. When it's 1 person trying to stop stuff and everyone else just sitting on their hands, maybe the protagonist reads this as license to continue because the group doesn't seem to be agreed that this kind of stuff should stop because they're also not joining in. So it's the collective coordination of the group that seems to be important. Okay, I don't want to, I'm now running out of time a bit. So another interesting question besides this collective coordination that people often ask is, okay, well, how dangerous is it for bystanders to intervene? And with our data, we can answer that too. We can look at how likely bystanders are when they intervene to be victimized themselves. And again, I want you to imagine, in the same way that I asked you before about how likely is someone to intervene, how likely do you think in our data, when a bystander intervenes, they themselves are victimized, they are punched or pushed or hit by the perpetrator? And again, you may be surprised to know, at least in our data, that that likelihood is actually very low. Only around 4% of cases in our data does a bystander get victimized by a perpetrator. And when that happens, it doesn't tend to be major violence. It just tends to be a push or a shove. And now that's not to say that there are never examples of bystanders intervening and being seriously injured. Of course there are, and we read about them in the press, but they are vanishingly rare compared to the usual likelihood of bystanders being victimized for intervening. In fact, what we discovered was that perpetrators are much more likely to receive aggression from bystanders. And you might think that that sounds a bit odd, but we originally thought that you would know who a perpetrator was by who threw the first punch. And we coded that kind of stuff up too. And in fact, we discovered that that wasn't the case. In our footage, the perpetrator does throw the first punch around about half the time. Victims sometimes throw the first punch on a very small proportion of occasion. That's kind of, they get their retaliation in first because they think they're about to get hit. Bystanders sometimes throw punches towards victims. We thought that would be much bigger. If you have this idea that people just gang up on the weak, then you might expect bystanders to be punching victims a lot, but that doesn't happen very much at all. Around 35% of the time, bystanders throw punches towards perpetrators. And they are doing that as a function of them telling the perpetrator to stop being aggressive. They say, stop, stop, stop. And when the bystander refuses to listen, they often throw punches at them to get them to listen. So they're using violence essentially in the service of non-violence. Okay, so my take-home message from this talk, what I really want to persuade you is that bystander intervention is actually much more normative than we think. It happens much more frequently than we're led to imagine. That bystander intervention is collective and it's coordinated, and that individual actors, even if they're determined, are not enough. Group processes are the thing which needs to be harnessed to make this bystander intervention successful. And the presence of others, the thing that we are told leads to diffusion of responsibility and bystander apathy and all that kind of stuff, the presence of others is actually not bad for helping. It's actually what we need to make helping work. I also want to tell you that the bystander effect, the thing that you know about, is also not the same as bystander non-intervention. Even if we put the bystander effect to one side, it's important to remember that having lots of people around is actually very, very good for victims. And that's because of something called the mechanical helping potential. If you've got one bystander around, and you compare that with an example where you've got 100 bystanders around, irrespective of the bystander effect, having 100 people just means there are so many more people who will help the victim, that victims are much more likely to be helped. So thinking about bystanders from the perspective of the victim, we want there to be lots of people around. And we also want to remember that the idea that we've had from psychology that the presence of lots of people around who is bad for bystanders is also not the case. Okay, so the future of bystander research, where are we going next? As I've said, I've been arguing we've been asking the wrong question. I think we need to know more about how we can make bystander intervention successful, how bystanders cooperate and how we can facilitate that, how we can support cooperation, how we can harness the power of the group to ensure successful bystander intervention. We need to stop focusing or obsessing on the presence or absence of others and think much more about the psychological relationships between all those people who are present in an emergency. And by that I mean we need to realize that there are psychological relationships amongst the bystanders, between bystanders and other bystanders, between the bystanders and the victim, but perhaps most importantly, between the bystanders and the perpetrator. And these different group relationships mean different kinds of things for the powers that are operating and the powers that can be harnessed to ensure successful intervention or to make sure that antisocial bystander behavior doesn't succeed. And let me give you an example to leave with, which again is very contemporary. And you probably have read about this or seen these pictures in the recent past. And these are the bystanders to the murder of George Floyd by Derick Chauvin. There's been quite a lot of news about this around the Chauvin murder conviction. And these pictures are, I think, reasonably iconic because what you will see on the left-hand side of your screen are the bystanders who gathered and attempted to intervene over the 9.5 minutes that Derick Chauvin kneeled on George Floyd's neck. And you can see in that picture a whole range of different sorts of folks, young, old, black and white. Those folks have different sorts of skills. So one of them is actually a paramedic. Another was a mixed martial arts expert. And they came and went, and you can see some of the footage trying to work between them. And if you look very carefully at the picture, you can see there's also stuff happening between the bystanders, one bystander holding another bystander back. So there's definitely that relationship. They all had a relationship, psychological relationship to George Floyd, trying desperately to help him. But of course, there are other groups and potential bystander relationships that are also important. And if you look at the right-hand screen, when the camera pans back, you see the police officers. There's Derick Chauvin and his colleagues. In fact, this picture comes from the body camera of one of the police officers. And you might think that those officers who watched Chauvin for 9.5 minutes could also be seen as potential bystanders who could have intervened, who had the power to intervene. And they have a different relationship to the perpetrator. So we need to consider that not all bystanders are the same. there are different kinds of bystanders, in-group and out-group bystanders, different relationships between bystanders and other bystanders and perpetrators, and that we need to embrace that and understand those sorts of dynamics if we're going to use social psychology to effectively harness the power of the group to increase the likelihood of bystander intervention in the future. Okay, I'm going to stop there by thanking some very talented folk that without whom this work could never have been done. Dr. Richard Philpott, who I work with in Lancaster, Anastasia Kovalenko, who's a PhD student I work with in Exeter, Dr. Marie Lingard, who leads a group in Amsterdam, and Dr. Lasse Liebst from Copenhagen. And this kind of work is very labor intensive, and without these folks, none of this could be done. And I also need to thank some of the research councils that have funded this work. And I will stop. Sorry, I've gone on much longer than I should have. I might actually get rid of the screen sharing in case there are some questions.
Yes, thank you, Mark. This was very interesting and very informative. We are all clapping at home. So we have quite a few questions. Of course, please keep them coming. So the first question is, does CCTV make bystanders intervention more likely in modern times because people know that others could find out that they were there and didn't intervene?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and we don't know very much in practice about exactly how modern social media, cameras, that kind of stuff, CCTV affects the nature of people's behavior, because there's not very much research which is actually done on it. There's quite a lot of concern that these kinds of technologies stop people from intervening because they think, well, if I just capture it on my own camera, then that's good enough. I don't need to actually do any intervention. Or if the CCTV cameras watch it, then someone else will see what's going on and I don't need to intervene. And that seems to be the moral anxiety. But I think in practice, that's not what's happening. These are just different kinds of bystander interventions. So I think, as I've been trying to persuade you, there's quite a lot of direct in-person intervention in any event. And I think people find different ways to do this sort of intervention. And sometimes people will use their phones as a way of capturing something that other people can use. Sometimes they'll do it because they literally can't. And in the George Floyd case, those bystanders stood and filmed because there was literally no other way they could do intervention. So I think it's quite a complex scenario. I think it's changing the ways in which bystanders can act. I don't think it's inhibiting or preventing people from doing it. And neither in a way do I think it makes it more likely. I just think it makes different forms of bystander intervention more possible.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I think that definitely there is also more room for new research for you there. Okay, our next question is, I don't know if you can see them, but I'll read them out anyway.
I can't.
Okay, then I'll read them. In self-report studies on bystander behavior, do you know if people tend to rate themselves as more likely to help than they actually would in real life?
Yes, that seems to be the case with this sort of stuff. I think often when people are asked, and they answer those sorts of questions, they want to present themselves as moral beings. I think nobody would sensibly say, well, if I saw someone in need, I wouldn't help. So we're doing a particular kind of work in answering those questions, which tends to suggest that we are more likely to report doing the right sorts of things. So I think that is one of the issues with this kind of research. It's not that you can't learn really interesting things, because it can tell us, for example, about what kinds of justifications for not intervening are acceptable or not, and that helps us to tackle those sorts of things. But we shouldn't just take people's word that they will intervene, or that they did intervene for a particular kind of reason, without trying to triangulate it with other sorts of data to be able to see whether the story they tell about what they've actually done is also supported by other bits of information to get a fuller picture.
Okay. The next question is a little bit long. but hopefully we can tackle it. So Marianne,
sorry, that
no worries.
It's not cats, it's phones.
Right. That's we're all used to that by now. So Marianne is asking, I can imagine that this would be difficult to determine when looking at CCTV in the nighttime economy in particular. I think she was saying this during your talk when you were showing something. I wonder whether the likelihood of bystander intervention is partly due to bystanders being part of a group, so they are friends with one of the people involved in the incident. Would we see less bystander intervention if those involved were not known to the bystanders?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's one that we have thought about, and we've done some work. Obviously, with the CCTV that we've got, we don't know anything about the people, so we don't know whether they know each other. We don't have any information about them as individuals. We also can't hear any sound, so we can't hear what they're saying to each other. But we wanted to see, precisely in the way that Marion was describing, whether we could analyze the footage in a way which told us whether we thought that people belonged to certain groups, whether this was one group altogether, or maybe two groups, or maybe even three groups. And so part of our coding was to get independent raters to see whether they could agree whether people in the footage belonged to the same group. They thought they belonged to the same group. And we can do that with a very high degree of reliability. So there are lots of tie signs that people give. They do touching, they stand a bit closer. So we've done that kind of stuff, and we've been able to say with a high degree of inter-rater reliability who belongs to which group. And then we can look at the degree to which people intervene in group. So the likelihood is they're intervening with people that they know, or across groups. And it is the case that people are much more likely to intervene within the group than across. But they do across group intervention. And we were also interested in, is it more dangerous to do across group than in group intervention? So we can look at these sorts of things. And group belongingness definitely makes a difference, because it often gives you greater rights. You can touch people that you know, for example, more than a stranger. You can probably get a bit closer to them. So these group processes are definitely shaping the behavior, and it's more likely that bystander intervention will be done within groups, and but it is also done across groups, and de-escalatory across groups as much as escalatory. So it's not just like West Side Story. It's often people trying to calm people down across groups just as much as they calm people down within groups.
Right. Yes, I imagine there's a bit of an additional comfort when you are with your friends and you are very assured that they will have your back.
Yes.
Or that they will judge you if you don't help.
A lot of the time we find that groups are doing self-policing. So there might be somebody in their group, and I think this is one of the key insights of a lot of this kind of research. And we've talked to, when we talk to people who police the nighttime economy, we often talk to them about this, that actually the groups are the biggest resource for keeping sometimes the members inside the groups who might be interested in a little bit of aggression or a little bit of trouble under control. They do a lot of work, partly because they don't want this kind of violence because it will spoil the night out. They don't want to have to go and spend time in the cells, or they don't want to have to go to A&E. So they just want a nice time. So they manage the behavior of the guy, and it's mostly a guy who's had a bit too much to drink and he's a bit aggressive, and they try and keep him calm. And so that internal policing is a real resource for making sure that when things begin, when there's a spark, that it's brought under control by the people who are there without the police having to get involved.
Right, that's really interesting. So the next question is actually sort of similar, but a bit of a follow-up. So following on from the comments, from the comments about the importance of relationship, I'd be very interested to know if the effect is the same if the group are partially known to each other, or at a workplace or school rather than in a public area. So maybe you can address the second part, if being in a familiar place, which kind of belongs to you because it's your school or university, makes a difference to being in a public space, like on the street.
The context where these things happen definitely makes a difference, and people feel ownership over the space, whether it's a workplace or a school. I think people also feel ownership over public spaces, and there's some work about people being more likely to intervene closer to their actual home where they live rather than further away, kind of circles, ever expanding circles of feelings of ownership. I think the feeling of being at home, feeling responsible for the place or responsible for behavior in the place is a really important facet of this kind of stuff, wanting to kind of maintain the kind of order and not wanting people to behave in a way which goes against the norms or the values which should be being expressed in these sorts of places. It's definitely stronger in places like schools and workplaces, I would imagine, but then you're not normally likely to get the same kind of behavior we see in the nighttime economy. But I still do think that folks can have a sense of ownership over public spaces, that this is the kind of place that is theirs, and that I mean, we often do that sort of stuff when we police other people around. So COVID has been a really interesting example of that, wanting people to wear masks, socially distance. We police the behavior of other people in those sorts of places. We think they should be doing that sort of stuff. But the question is definitely right to say that the feeling of the relationship between who I am and what this place is and what it means to me makes those kinds of norms and values and acting in terms of them much more likely to happen.
Right. So another question asks, given that your CCTV footage was of incidents that took place in the nighttime economy, how much did you and your colleagues consider the role of alcohol?
So there's a lot of the explanations for how and why people behave in the way that they do often begin and end with alcohol as the explanation that people are disinhibited, and because they've had too much to drink, they can't control themselves, and that's why they end up acting in a violent and aggressive way. But of course, the same notions of disinhibition also apply to people who are prepared to act in a pro-social fashion. And so I think alcohol clearly is playing a role in people's behavior, but I don't think it's just making them violent and aggressive. I think it enhances some of the forces which are there, both for pro-social and antisocial outcomes. We try to go beyond just thinking that alcohol is the important thing to consider here, because I guess it's not likely we're going to have prohibition anytime soon, so we're never going to be able to take alcohol out of the equation. We can do some stuff to stop people drinking to the excess in the way that some people do some of the time, but we're also interested in how, even when that happens, we can use these social psychological processes which are still operating. People are still trying to use norms and values that they think are being transgressed by some of these people who've had too much to drink, to try and get them to behave reasonably and sensibly. So yes, I think alcohol, of course, is important, and we've got no way of measuring the alcohol content in any of the people that we've got on our CCTV videos. But I think there is a very strong social psychology story still to be told that isn't trumped by the idea that people are just drunk.
Okay, we have a couple more questions, so we'll hopefully get through them. So Danielle says, really fascinating talk, thank you. You mentioned about focusing more on the psychological relationships between bystander to bystander, bystander and victim, bystander and perpetrator. Could you expand a bit more on what you mean and how this would be carried out in future research?
So I think once you begin to look at these different sorts of relationships, you see that there are different kinds of things going on. There are different sorts of bystanders, if you like. So if we want to, let's say, if we want to tackle violence against women, and we want to increase the likelihood that people will take responsibility for the behavior of men who are perpetrating acts of violence against women, what we want to do is to get men to take the responsibility for the behavior of other men who might be doing these sorts of acts, because we need those men as bystanders to see the behavior of these men not as something which is different from them, but which might be in some way reflecting on them, or part of the way in which you should have responsibility as a man to act around these sorts of things. So you're thinking about those kinds of groupie relationships to the perpetrator as much as you are to victim or to bystanders. So it's beginning to think about these different sorts of relationships, trying to get bystanders to feel a sense of solidarity with each other so that they will act together as a group. That's also important. We don't always feel that we share groupiness with other people in public spaces. So, the classic example of this is when we could, or when it was much easier to travel on tube trains, you're often on a tube with loads and loads of other people. So you're physically present with these people in the tube, but you've never felt more like an individual because these people are in your space. Maybe they're breathing on you. Maybe they got body odor. But I mean, in that classic kind of British way, if something happens, like if the lights go out or the train stops, then suddenly everyone starts talking to each other and you feel some sort of sense of psychological connection. And you begin to see each other as part of the same group. And there's been lots of work on, for example, things like terrorist attacks on trains, where strangers act in very pro-social ways towards each other because they share psychological identity. They move from being individuals in the same space to sharing psychological group membership, which makes them much more pro-social and helpful towards each other. So we need to think about that kind of stuff too. How do we get people to feel a sense of shared identity in public spaces as bystanders? And then, of course, there is the classic kind of stuff, which most of the traditional work does, which is how do we get people to feel a sense of shared identity or connection to victims? I mean, that's the more classic one. We've done less work on shared identity amongst bystanders, and we've definitely done a lot less work on how we get members of groups who may have perpetrators in them to feel responsibility for the behavior of those folk and challenge them directly.
Okay, maybe we will manage to answer the last two quick questions in the next 3 minutes. So the first one is, you said that 3 bystanders intervention is most effective in de-escalating a situation. Would a 4th and 5th person make it even more effective, or does it max out? So is 3 the magic number?
Oh, that's a really good question. We don't have any real data to answer that, and that's a really good empirical question. I think we have got some data which shows that beyond probably 7 or 8 bystanders in one of these sorts of instances, there just isn't enough space for other folk to get involved. So whether it's a kind of magic number sort of story, or whether it's something to do with just the physical operation of the number of people who can operate in a space, is a bit unclear. But I think the take-home message is that it is a collective and coordinated thing amongst the bystanders, which is more likely to produce positive, successful outcomes. So, and whether it's 3 or 5 or 7, the thing we need to know more about is how we get that coordination, how we facilitate that, how we persuade people that other people are going to do this, and that you need to coordinate with them, and we need to work together to make this work. Most of the time at the moment, the public health initiatives which try to promote bystander intervention say things like, the presence of other people is likely to make you not intervene. You need to rise above this bystander apathy. You need to rise above this, and you need to act. You need to take responsibility, which is a very individualistic strategy. It's a different story to tell people, look, bystander intervention is very common. People will intervene. Other people will intervene with you to do this kind of stuff. What you need to do is not try to make yourself intervene, but try to coordinate with the other people who are also there to intervene. And through that coordination, the strength of other people around helping you will make this successful.
Let's squeeze in the final question, which is maybe a bit related. Would diffusion of responsibility vary depending on the victim who needed help? So, for example, would diffusion of responsibility be more likely for someone who seems drunk or is homeless?
Yeah, there's lots of research which shows that the relationship to the victim and how that's constructed by the bystanders will have an impact on whether people will intervene. So if you don't feel a sense of connection with this person, or the costs are high, you feel that this person. So if this person is drunk or they look like they might throw up on you or that kind of stuff, that kind of connection might prevent that assumption about the costs might prevent you doing that kind of stuff. So there's definitely those sorts of impediments to thinking about those sorts of things, whether you see them as costs of intervention or the failure of people to develop a shared set of identities. I think depends on your theoretical orientation. I think one of the really important messages, though, about this sort of stuff is that if we are given messages by our opinion formers and our politicians that there are some people who are not deserving of being in public space, that are dangerous or threatening or suspicious in some way because they are homeless or they are refugees or they are not like us, that kind of stuff is often the barrier to producing really successful connection to folk that need to be helped in public space.
Right. Thank you so much for all these responses and for educating us, Mark. I think that everyone really appreciated the talk. Thank you to everyone who asked questions and to everyone who listened. I think we had quite an interesting discussion here. So next week we will have Dr. Lara Ormeling, who will talk about lying and aging. So please join us then at the same time, the same place. You can find the link. In the meantime, you can follow us on social media. And I think that's it for today. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks for inviting me. Bye.